Good day, class. Welcome to Laboratory Operations 2, the sequel to the first Laboratory Operations course you took. This is going to cover LIS and EHR systems, SOPs, preventative and corrective maintenance, as well as some other systems you might encounter in the lab that require the transfer of patient information. Now first, we have a couple of objectives. They're not too difficult, but 4 cognitive and 1 affective. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions on answering these objectives after this lecture. Now first, we'll talk about what an electronic medical record and laboratory information systems are. Now, in order to understand these systems, we really need to understand what healthcare information is, because these systems are put in place in order to collect, store, and transfer this information to the patient and the healthcare provider. So HIPAA does a nice job of consolidating, in air quotes I should say, the definition for health information, which is any information, whether oral or recorded in any form or medium, that will it be created or received by a healthcare provider, health plan, public health authority, employer, life insurer, school or university, or healthcare clearinghouse. And B, relates to the past, present, or future physical or mental health or condition of an individual, the provision of healthcare to that individual, or the past, present, or future payment of the provision of healthcare to an individual. So that's quite a mouthful. So what that all means is that any information, whether oral or written, and that includes emails, phone calls, going to the doctors for a quick little visit, anything like that is actually considered healthcare information. And we want to make sure that that's documented so that the patient has a thorough history in case they need to fall back to some sort of previous diagnosis or visit, as well as being able to transfer that information to another healthcare provider and make it easily accessible. Now in the old days, we used to have these nice little stacks of folders where every doctor's visit would get documented. So, you know, when you were young and you fell off your bike and maybe broke or bruised your knee and got an x-ray, as you go into college and you had that hold my beer moment that didn't work out so well, and as an adult when you just kind of do your regular routine maintenance, pre-grad school vaccinations and things like that, they were all documented in here. Now we can do that in a nice, easy information systems. So healthcare information systems are designed to collect and organize that information. So rather than going through all this, we can do it just on our computers in front of us. And all that healthcare information, everything we talked about before through that HIPAA definition is protected by HIPAA. So anything, like I said, it could be a phone call, it could be a written note, an email, that is automatically considered healthcare information and automatically protected for the patient. So what kind of informatics systems do we have? Well, informatics systems aren't overly complex. At the end of the day, they're just systems designed to collect and transfer information. So things like email and inter-office communications are technically an informatics system. Electronic medical records, laboratory information systems, some cassette tracking and voice recognition softwares that you might have used in your labs or will see, telemedicine, telepathology, specimen imaging. These all fall under the value of informatics systems because they can potentially contain patient information that needs to be included with the patient's file. Now those systems aren't exhaustive, and there might be many more that you encounter that anything that includes a hint of patient information might fall under that bracket of healthcare informatics. So when you're trying to consider a system for hospital use, some of the things we want to take into account are whether that's secure, safe, and protected. Remember, HIPAA is protecting all that information. It can be a huge liability if someone can easily just go in and type in your password as 12345 and access all that information. It doesn't really do the job it's supposed to be doing for an informatics system. The system needs to be auditable, which means if you had a question or if CAP came in and had a question about some sort of patient care or insurance providers, you can easily pull that information up and follow the paper record for that point of care and the interactions between healthcare providers. You need to be able to back it up. You know, sometimes systems fail, and you actually make sure that you have the backup hard drive or those piles of folders. Some hospitals actually just keep those in their basement with the hope that they'll never have to dig through them, but they're there if they need them. Systems should be easy to use, right? You don't want a system that's going to be difficult and a pain in the butt to work around, because people will inevitably find a way to work around it in a non-effective way. And we'll talk about that more when we get into implementation of these systems. You want to have two-way communication. So what we'll notice is that almost every department in a hospital setting will have its own system to do its own task. It'll collect its data for its very specific function in the hospital, but ultimately all those systems need to work together and play nice. So that becomes important for the system. You want something that's easy to maintain, right? if it's going to take an effort when this thing breaks down or just preventative maintenance, it's not going to be very pleasant to keep in the hospital. You also want to make sure you have a degree of user control, but sometimes off-the-shelf use is practical as well. So when we say off-the-shelf use, that's like grabbing the latest edition of Windows and installing it on your desktop, and it's good to go from out of the box, versus sometimes you just want to tweak it. So you can get into library settings, you can get into some of the basic coding and adjust it to what the hospital or the healthcare environment needs. You do want to be able to track your metrics, and when we say metrics, that means being able to say, how many cases have we gotten today? How many cases do we get in a year? Where do those cases spend most of their time? Is there any bottlenecks we need to be aware of? All that stuff is actually much more easy to track when we have these informatics systems in place because it becomes digital. And then at the end of the day, we want to meet the requests of the users. So if the system isn't ideal for the healthcare environment, why are you going to order it? Why are you going to install it? We've gotten to a point where there's plenty of systems out in the environment now, so it makes it very easy to just come back and say, okay, this one doesn't meet my needs, but this one does. Will you always get perfect? Maybe not. But as long as you are able to adapt to the system and use it in your work environment without too much difficulty, that will fall into an ideal system. So first we're going to take a look at electronic medical records, or EMRs for short. And this is an electronic record of all patient information that is received to the hospital. And these are going to be very all-encompassing. And the goal is sort of a unified system that all systems in the hospital that can communicate with and drop off information. So if a patient calls or has lab results, it will eventually make its way into their EMR system. And if you're the one I'm most familiar with using is Epic, but there are others out there. And these are going to be very organizational specific. Not necessarily the software itself, but the breakdown of the software. So I already talked about how these systems can be kind of manipulated for the specific needs of the healthcare environment, and that's exactly what these systems will do. So maybe you don't need all the features that Epic can provide for your hospital. Maybe you're a smaller hospital and you can just get away with some of the bare bones, and that's fine. But ultimately, we want to have a system that can consolidate all the data regardless of where the patient goes off. If they want to go to a satellite clinic, that information should eventually make its way to the EMR. All the information from Path Lab, all the information from radiology, even though they'll have their own individual systems, they'll ultimately make their way to the EMR. And that way we have a consolidated area where all the patient information can be displayed. So ideally, we're going to try to move away from paperless and keep this all digital, maybe just have a couple of hard drive backups. But a lot of places, like I mentioned, will keep their hard drive or keep their paper files intact, kind of stored away. And sometimes it's a little bit of tech fear, and sometimes it's just a safety precaution because maybe they have multiple backups in place. But going forward, a lot of hospitals are now using solely these functions, these EMRs, electronic entering of data. Now, big picture-wise, there is a slight difference between electronic health record and a patient health record. So an EMR is organizational specific, whereas electronic health record is sort of nationally specific. And what I say by that, it means you can basically have multiple systems communicating with each other, even though they're not specifically tied to the same organization. So if you go to Hospital A in the Northeast, decide to take a trip in the Southeast, these hospitals might be working on the same electronic health record system. In that case, their information is easy to share. But the dream is to get a patient health record. And I like to think of it kind of like a Black Mirror style thing. You get the barcode in your arm, and basically your health record is transferred with you. So it doesn't matter where you go. If you're in the US, if you're in Europe, if you're in Asia or Africa, any of those countries can theoretically just pull up all your patient health records just by communicating with you, just by accessing it through maybe a little card. It doesn't have to be the barcode system, but my dystopic future is always coming to the forefront with these technical things. So that was the goal ultimately of the Affordable Care Act, and it's obviously gotten some road bumps since then, but the goal was basically to create an entire electronic health record in the United States so that regardless of where you go, you'll have access to your own health information. And we're not there with the patient health record yet, but maybe someday. I think over in Europe they've gotten better about that, where you actually just have your own little card that you can carry and everything's located on that. Makes it easy to pull up. So if we take a look at this nice little map of the United States here, notice it's all green, so it doesn't really tell us anything differential between the states, which is just fine, and that's a good thing for this particular graph, because what we're looking at is the percentage of EHR systems across the United States. And as you can see, we're all about in the 50 to 75% range. Unfortunately, in these states, none of them are quite peaking past that 75%. So we don't have any states with hospitals where every single hospital has an EHR. Is that problematic? Yeah, for several reasons, and this kind of ties into your affective objectives, something to think about, and we can talk about later. But one of the things to think about, and this is sort of a follow-up chart, is first off, the top part is telling us how many of all physicians available will have either an EHR system or a certified EHR system. And certified just means it's one of the top docs, something like Epic, that it is certified to interact with any system that comes into, that it'll come into. So right there, the adoption rate is pretty good. We kind of got past to almost to the 90% of just adopting any sort of electrical system. But the reason we want these things certified is because if we look at the second chart below, we want to be able to send that information, right? Ultimately, we are mobile people. Even if you're not going to move, likely you might find yourself in another state or another country, another city even, if you're just going to stay relatively local. So if something happens, what is going to happen with that information? What if you're allergic to penicillin and you go to a hospital, you're unconscious, and they happen to want to give you some, and they can't pull that up because the hospital you went to initially either had a non-certified EHR or they're still using paper records, God forbid. But that means that information is not getting out there, and your life is potentially in jeopardy because you don't have that information transferred. So like I said, ultimately the goal is we want to be able to let that information transfer between facility to facility in order to facilitate better patient care. That's ultimately the goal with everything we do, right? So looking at just electronic medical records, here are a few systems that you might see in a facility or a hospital that you work at or you do a clinical rotation at. Most of the time it's going to be Epic O2, that's the one I'm most familiar with, but you might see some of these other ones. We live in a capitalistic society, so everyone wants to at least try to make a better system, which is good. But the list for all these systems are by no means definitive, and new systems will constantly be added. Companies will merge and create one big system, so don't use this as an exhaustive list. But just to get an idea of what a EHR looks like, this is kind of the front page. So notice you can see the history of this particular patient's head injury, and some basic information about that, like times it happened, dates of visits, and things like that. So every visit that the patient had, every phone call can be included in this system. And usually you'll see a breakdown like this, where if you go to the far opposite side, I won't cross the streams here, you get usually the snapshot feature up at the very top there is very helpful in giving kind of a breakdown of the patient's demographics, some of their basic health information that might be pertinent to any visit, and maybe their most recent visit or the biggest complaints for their recent visits as well. But all this information is broken down, usually pretty easy to follow. If you get access to these systems, you can kind of play around with them and see if you can find the information. You don't really want to be accessing information you don't have any need to, so remember HIPAA. It also applies to us. We can't just go around looking up data from our friends and family just to see where they're going to the hospital and what kind of things are going on in their life. So make sure you keep it to cases you're actually working on. But just kind of finding what you need. There's medications on there, immunizations, everything's going to be documented in here. And if you look hard enough, every visit the patient had, and if it's a complete electronic health record system, everything they've had from the time they started going to the healthcare provider should be in one of these EMR systems. So at the end of the day, those are not systems we inherently work with in the surgical path lab. Ultimately, our reports will find their way into an EHR, but what we usually deal with is a laboratory information system, or LIS. And LIS is basically going to be the foundation point for all our clinical and surgical pathology. So everything will eventually find their way into the LIS system, and the LIS system will consolidate that and then transfer it into the EHR system. So as you can see, these start becoming building blocks on each other. So when we think about an LIS, the stuff we're going to use, what is the goal of using an LIS, especially a system that's specifically designed for pathology, rather than just trying to have some sort of tack on to a electronic medical record system that happens to do path as well? Well, first, we can get easy access to a lot of information. So a lot of times you might get a cancer case, and if you type in the patient's information or MRN, you can pull up all their previous biopsy results. Or if they went to heme, or if they had flow cytometry done, any of those tests are going to be in your LIS system. So you can see if there was problematic cells on a previous biopsy. You can see if they had a problematic flow or cytometry test. All that stuff you can pull up right at your bench because you will have access to an LIS. You also want to make sure that there's quality assurance, right? So we want to make sure that we can kind of dictate what the flow of work is in the lab. Ideally, a lot of reports want to be turned around in about 2 to 3 days from the time you get the case to the time it gets grossed, processed, and the pathologist looks at it. Most times it's 48 hours, sometimes a little bit longer. But if you're not hitting that mark, we have to find out why. You know, if stuff's getting stuck in a particular area, if it's getting stuck in histology, if we have staffing issues, if CAP comes along and wants to make sure we're playing nice by the rules, we got to make sure we can audit that. So quality insurance is really nice and easy in an LIS system because it's easy to pull up. Just pull up a case, you can see where it is, you can see who accessed the case, who grossed it, who signed it out, all that information available at the tips of your fingertips. Ain't technology great? Additionally, you're going to want a quick review of previous results. So I kind of mentioned this, right? You want to be able to pull it up and say, okay, was this cancer before? Am I looking for a particular type of cancer? Pull up some biopsy results. Oh yeah, okay, they had stage 4, so it should be pretty aggressive. If I'm not seeing anything, maybe there's something else going on with this particular specimen. So all that stuff being accessible is very nice. Additionally, you might have to implement new procedures and protocols. So CAP comes out with new training guidelines, or perhaps you start getting, maybe a new surgeon comes along and requires their grossing slightly different, or they want to handle their specimens slightly different. So you want to implement that. So these LIS softwares, they're usually customizable. And again, if we're talking about the most common one, it's usually Telepath. Usually you can build these libraries up so that if you have common cases, so for example, liver biopsies require a lot of special stains. You guys may have talked about that. Rather than having to go through and enter all those manually when you're a PA or an accessioner, you can say, oh, it's a liver biopsy. This is what we do on all liver biopsies, automatically ordered. Billing's already set. And it makes it easy. Now you get some other specimens that you don't usually have in that facility. Well, now you can update the procedures, or maybe protocols come along that's like, okay, we really don't need that stain because it doesn't really show any effective results. Drop it off. So it makes ordering special stains, frozen sections, it makes the process of billing a lot easier. Remote access. So a lot of times you'll have access through something like Citrix, so that if you're really stressed out about a case you had and you want to make sure that you did it right, or you're like, did I really submit 3 lymph nodes or was it 4? You can pull it up at home and say, well, 4 lymph nodes submitted entirely. Good. All right, I thought I counted 4. So it's kind of nice. If you want to share that information remotely too, pathologists can consolidate without actually having to be in the room together. And we'll talk about more ways to do that later. And eventually, you want to have ease of billing. So I mentioned this, that easy procedures and protocols can be easily implemented into the LIS. I don't want to say LIS system, that's like saying ATM machine. But into the LIS, and all the CPT coding is automatically implied in there. And just by the time it gets signed out, the billing is pretty much done. So no one wants to work on the back end trying to figure out, okay, what do we bill for this specimen? How many lymph nodes do we get? How many slides do we create? All that fun stuff gets automatically done in an LIS. And then eventually you want to make sure that we can do other systems. So just like the EMR can take all the systems from the hospital and consolidate them. In the lab, we work with a bunch of other different systems that aren't as grand, but you want to make sure your voice recognition works. You want to make sure if you have any specimen photography, you can easily integrate that into your LIS. So you want to make sure that your LIS plays nice with all these other systems that you're going to be utilizing. And we'll talk about those other systems shortly. So when you're working with an LIS, and this is the real exciting stuff, we'll talk about how to assign cases, numbers, and things like that. Anything that you get through pathology is going to be documented through an LIS. We want to get it logged, some sort of accessioner. Now, we often think in terms of surge path, but there's other places in anatomic and clinical pathology, right, that are going to handle specimens. And want to make sure that it's tracked. And in some places we'll have cassette tracking. Some can just track because you have to assign out who grossed the specimen. It'll put your name assigned to the case. Who ran the flow cytometry, you'll put that person's name by there. and then it'll document when the case was signed out. So all the information is readily available. So when you accession a specimen, let's take a look at SurgePath, for example. A lot of case numbers are going to be very similar to this. This is kind of a generic flow, but you're going to basically get AAXX, YY. So what do those numbers mean? So the first prefix correlates to the specific department. So you can get SurgePath, cytology, micro, all those fun places. Even autopsy will have its own designation. And so usually it might just be an abbreviation like SP for SurgePath, or CT for cytology, or FC for flow. It kind of just varies on what the organization set up for their specific designations. And then you want to make sure you designate what year it is. So this will be SP20, so surgical pathology 2020. And then you'll just assign a sequential case number, starting with 1 and just working your way up until you're done for the year, and then you'll rotate it. So depending on your hospital, you may go up to 5 digits, you may go to 4, you may go longer. But it'll kind of just look like this. So you'll start off with 1, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then when you hit that round off in December 31st, 2020, you get to start off on, you know, SP21, case number 00001. It's always kind of fun to, we used to play like some fun games where you try to guess what the last case number would be, and then who would get the first case number. I don't know, it's kind of dorky, but you got to keep yourself sane somehow. So then once these reports are generated and these accession numbers, that's going to tie to that specific case for the rest of that case. So while you're grossing it, while it's going through histology, while the pathologist is signing out the case, it's all going to have that single case number. Now, the case number can change based on the patient. So some hospitals will have designated protocols for when to tack on specimens to the same case. So usually it's associated with the same procedure, but sometimes they'll say if it's something was done within 2 hours, they can include it in the same case number. But let's say the patient comes back the next day and gets another biopsy. Well, if their first case was SP20123445, assuming there was no other cases, or let's just say if there was, we'll say they come back tomorrow and their case is now SP2013612, right? So it does not tie to the patient. The only number that's tied to the patient is the MRN. So the case number will change, but that's something that you can still look up. If you know the patient's MRN, you can find all case numbers assigned to that particular patient. And when everything gets signed out, it creates a nice consolidated report that's maintained in the LIS and then also transferred into the EMR. So we have our backup in the LIS essentially, and we also have the main report in the EMR that the patient can look at. So a lot of hospitals are doing patient portals now where path results will get uploaded, radiology stuff will get uploaded, so they can just look at that with the touch of a button. And I mentioned billing. The nice thing is usually CPT codes are automatically assigned, assuming the specimen is accessioned properly, they're automatically assigned to that case. Now, the nice thing is, let's say you assigned it as a benign thyroid 88307, it turns out to be very malignant, and it becomes an 88309 once the pathologist looks at it. It's easy for him to go in and just fix it to an 88309, no big deal. All right, so we can always adjust that, but the basis is there, and assuming you set up your library properly, it makes your billing, and that's nothing we really inherently have to deal with as pathicists, but it makes the people who do deal with billing that much happier, and it makes it easier for them, which is always good. All right, so again, just like with EMR systems, here's a couple of LIS systems you might find or work with. Copath and PowerPoint, they're both owned by SunQuest. Those tend to be the most common ones. I've worked with WindowPath in the past in Las Vegas. I'm not a huge fan, but to each their own, and we'll talk about whether or not liking systems is important at the end of the day. But again, these are a few examples. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's something to be mindful of. And even though we're going to talk about some of the overview and particularly focus on Copath, a lot of the systems work similarly, and when you get there, you'll have time to sort of train yourself and get used to the system. Just like anything, it just takes time and effort to get comfortable with the software and find out all the little cool things you can do. All right, so let's take a look. We are going to go through a mock accessioning grossing specimen. I know that sounds thrilling, so sit back, grab some popcorn, and let's see what happens, right? So this is a Copath face, and honestly, this is probably like a 6 or 7 years old, a Copath, but it still looks like MS-DOS days. But if you got the updated one, the interface is a lot smoother, so trust me on that one. But the first thing we're going to do is we want to create a new specimen. So over here, I have circled new specimen. Okay, we'll click on that, and what's going to pop up is, okay, you're going to create a new specimen. So the encounter number, which you see up there, should be nothing we have to worry about. Instead, we want to worry about the specimen class. So we can see that's filled out below as surgical pathology. It's a surg path specimen. Okay, so that's going to mean that any number sequentially is going to fall into the surgical pathology accession numbers. Okay, and then it goes, you can see the recent numbers down here. So this tells you all the cases that you recently accessioned. Some places, when I was working at KU, for example, they like to do similar cases as every other number, just in case you're grossing a GI biopsy and you don't have SP300 as one colon biopsy and SP301 as another colon biopsy. It's just kind of an internal Q&A thing that they would do to make sure you're not accidentally mixing up the cases. So some hospitals might have self-implied or self-applied ruling like that. Copath or most of these LIS systems will not automatically do that. Okay, so we're going to pull it in. We'll make sure that it's a surgical path specimen. We're going to take the next logical number. So if we're fine with it being SP 2012 300, then we'll click OK. So next is going to pull up, all right, so here's your case number. Tell me about it. What part is it? So part type is really pulling from your library of cases. So if you previously set up a case library to say like, okay, we have benign and malignant URI. So I want to make sure that they're documented together or separated, because benign URI might only require 6 cassettes, where malignant we're probably looking at 10 to 12. So these protocols or libraries are previously set up so that all you have to do is enter in the system, and if it's working with your cassette printer properly, then that means your cassettes are going to automatically print off for that case. Some places don't have things like that, or they'll ask you how many cassettes you might want for a case. But it's nice when it's already kind of built in. Same thing with templates, and we'll talk about templates when we get into voice recognition. But all that stuff can kind of be automatically applied if your part types are properly identified initially. So you'll pick your part type, and it's going to kind of give you any of the physicians down there that worked on this case, the submitting physician who actually sent the specimen. Some of that stuff will be automatically populated. Otherwise, you can just look at the requisition sheet and enter it in for you. And once we decide on the case, so this one was entered in as a, it's not the same case as this 362, but let's just say for demonstration purposes, this was the same case. It was inputted as a appendix other than incidental, and you'll find that only one cassette is necessary for that. So our printers just created one cassette. So next we want to go into our grossing. So here we'll hit the histology button. What we're looking at here is the number of cassettes. Now they're printing off 8, so maybe they suspect some pathology, or maybe we got a crazy pathologist on our hands. Who knows? Always a gamble. But right now you see basically all cassettes that are assigned to this case. We don't see number 1, but basically we can assume it's there. So it's 1 through 8 right now. And then here you can assign other things like whether you want special staining. Again, a lot of this stuff is automatic, and the accessioners will typically do it, but at least you're kind of exposed, and you can use this next year when answering objectives on how to answer stuff, or if you're trying to sort of work with an LIS when you're in your clinical site. All right, so ultimately we get to the histology, we break it down to just 4 cassettes. All are just going to be H&E stain. We got 1 for decalcification, notice that up there. So that's going to have its own CPT coding. So all that will be taken care of in the back end. And so we get 4 cassettes printed, and now we want to go gross the specimen. So you'll get the specimen on your bench. A lot of that stuff would have been handled by the accessioners. And what you'll do is go to the gross, and if you have voice dictation, sometimes you can say like gross specimen or case number 1234 or 300, whatever it is, and you get something that looks like this. And then what you want to do is gross description. And so if your transcription, this will be filled in by the transcriptionist. If your voice recognition, basically it's going to pull up a separate document when we look at the voice recognition, and it'll kind of outline what you're dictating, and then when you're done, it'll place it right in this box here. So that's sort of the gist of an LIS working. So if you have experience, if you've been a histotech, if you've been a gross tech, if you've worked or shadowed some of the PAs, you've probably seen some of those systems. They're pretty straightforward. Things are going to be a little bit different, and ideally I'd like to get sort of a mock system in place some way, shape, or form. But when you get to your facility, take some time to work at the front desk and just see how specimens are accessioned, see how cases are logged in, check out their library and what their protocols are with templates and and cassette printing and things like that. So next, we'll take a look at cassette tracking. So here is a system that people are starting to implement into their workflow. And the goal here is creating these barcodes that they can put on cassettes, slides, containers, and any other sort of separate product that might be tied to that particular case. And the nice thing is you can scan these barcodes and it'll automatically pull up all the information you need. It'll tell you where the specimen has been, where it needs to go to, which pathologist it's been assigned to. Is it? You can also look in the histology department. So let's say you have a case, maybe that appendix we were working on, should be a barcode on it. Let's say, you know what, I wonder what happened to that appendix. Pathologist is complaining he doesn't have the slides. Let's pull it up, give it a scan, beep, and see where it is. And it'll tell us everywhere that specimen has been, because theoretically you're supposed to be scanning it at your station when you're working on this specimen. So you get the container, you scan it saying I'm starting this case, then you have all your cassettes laid out with the same barcode and say, okay, I'm submitting 4 cassettes, beep, 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 beep. And those are tied to the case now, and anything else you have to make sure you delete. And then they'll go to histology, and every slide that they created, even the multiple levels, they're going to create barcodes so they can say, okay, I made 6 slides for this specimen, beep, 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 I lost count. So, but at the end of the day, the goal here is for quality assurance, right? So all that information, we talked about the importance for LIS to be able to track metrics. This is the perfect way to do it. So let's say maybe specimens tend to be spending a longer time in histology than they used to. Maybe that means there's a staffing issue, it's equipment issues. Maybe someone in the histology department mentioned that there was a broken microtome. No one worked to fix it, or maintenance hasn't come yet, and it's been kind of inhibiting the workflow for a while. And that will show up with these metrics. It's like, geez, this case has been in histology twice as long as it normally is. Maybe we should look into that. So it's very useful for tracking metrics. Some of the problems I've run into this is making sure that the scans are scanned properly, especially on the cassettes. Depending on how they print the cassettes, sometimes there's some little irregularities in the surface, and that can cause issues when scanning. So if the system works perfectly, awesome. Now, again, we'll talk about implementation of these systems. Some of the problems are whenever you improve quality assurance, you're ultimately going to add more time to your workflow. And a lot of people struggle with that, but you also have to remember that at the end of the day, the goal is patient care. And as long as the patient is getting cared for, if it requires an extra 2 minutes for a case, it's kind of a price you have to pay. So again, here's sort of the circle. You can see here the patient is coming into the system. They collect their samples and we get it barcoded. They accession it, they gross it, we get it processed. It's in the histology department, staining. We can scan the slides to make sure we see that. So again, this is whatever slide, whatever barcode you scan, will pull up this information in your system. It'll say, oh, it's been handed off to the pathologist. It's, whoever's been assigned to should have this case, as you can see over here. And then ultimately, when we get the case signed out, we can give those results to the patient. So it lets us track this whole process, basically from receiving a case to signing out a case, gives us exact information on the flow of that specimen and the products after that. So kind of cool, as long as it's working effectively. And ultimately, that's sort of the thing with these systems. Assuming they're working well, they're great. Nothing always works great, though. Case in point, voice recognition. I think this has gotten better. I was using one a couple months ago. I've not been too familiar with VoiceBrook or voice recognition software. I'm used to more transcription-based. Transcription kind of fun, but it's also a little slower. What transcription does is you dictate, it gets recorded, sent to transcription. They listen to your recording, type it up, enter it into Telepath, that little text box that you saw, and then they'll tell you, or you have to make an effort to go look and read, make sure that it is what you said. They got your measurements right and all that other stuff. So it adds an extra step. Voice recognition, whatever you talk gets written down. You can look and review your case right there, and then press send, case is done. So we've just kind of bypassed that whole transcription process. And what a lot of places are doing now when they get their transcriptionists or move from transcription to voice recognition, they're actually going to use their transcriptionists as editors now. So let's say even though you sent your report off, you were happy with your dictation, but you get it to the pathologist, or even after the pathologist, these transcriptionists can basically just read the case, make sure there's no editing errors or misspellings or things like that they can fix, because ultimately we want the documents to look professional. The patients will ultimately see these, and or other physicians or healthcare providers will see these, and you don't want to have a misspelling on your hand or something like you mispronounced lymphoma, like I so often do. But some of the softwares that you'll probably encounter is Dragon Medical and VoiceBrook. There's also a software called Nuance. Typically, Dragon and VoiceBrook are kind of the two main softwares you'll encounter. I've not used Dragon Medical professionally. I've used mostly VoiceBrook, but I hear they work, especially now, very nicely. And what usually you see in a VoiceBrook screen is this. So as you're talking, basically I would say received in formalin labeled with the patient's name, medical record, number, and quote, colon biopsy, close quote, and it'll type it all like that. And a lot of times with these voice recognition softwares, you can do short text. So if I can say, like, I'm always going to say received in formalin labeled with patient name and medical record number, instead of saying that, I can say start case, and it prints it there. And then say whatever it's labeled on. And all you have to do is implement what the label of the specimen is. And this also gives way to templates. So I'm kind of on the fence with templates, and it seems to be a lot of what a lot of healthcare providers are going to. And this is just kind of a funny cartoon, because ultimately, yeah, what we do is very repetitious at the end of the day. And so templates make sense, right? You know, rather than just saying the same thing over again for benign uteri, might as well just like, all right, all I need to change is the measurements, and if I see anything funny, I'll just put it there, and always submit the same number of cassettes, and et cetera, et cetera. But the problem I have with templates is when we use templates, we become complacent, and it makes it much more likely that things will kind of fly by, because you get so used to just, all right, put in my numbers, put in the cassettes, call it a day. You might have missed something that was a little pertinent. Maybe there's hemorrhaging on the serosal surface of the uteri. Or maybe the skin had a noticeable lesion or mole that you didn't document because it wasn't in the template to document it. It might have said just other findings, and you just kind of bypassed it. So if you are at a place where they're using templates, and a lot of CAP synoptic reports are doing this, so not only do grossing practitioners like ourselves or gross techs have templates, but pathologists will have templates. So they'll have the CAP synoptic reports where they can just say malignant cells, or check a box for a grade, check a box for a location, go in, sign it out, and call it a day. It's nice because it gives you an idea of the things you should check on in a thorough template, but you have to make sure it's thorough to begin with. So my word of advice, when you're out there doing your job for the first time, you're in a clinical site, don't use the templates. Just kind of, even if the place is like, let's use them, or they make you use them, okay, use them, but then try to dictate without the template. And see how far you get, because it really is a skill, being able to talk and cut at the same time. And there's a certain art to it that I don't want you to lose. So that's my philosophical touch for this lecture. Okay, so now we'll talk about telepath. Let's say the movement of electrons from one space to another is just way too long for you to deal with, and you just need that information communicated right now through mental connection. They're telepath. Actually, telepath is what we talk about when we're referring to being able to communicate pathological information from afar. The most common way to do this is through slide scanning. So the nice thing is, with an LIS, we can facilitate the incorporation of slides from one location to another. So you can have someone designated after histology prints off these slides, gets them ready to go. They can start scanning them, putting them into the LIS, and the pathologist, whether it's a pathologist at that facility or maybe a pathologist that's working in multiple facilities, they can kind of organize their cases. Or let's say that a pathologist needs to confer with an old colleague or someone who used to work at the hospital that might have worked on the patient's case before. Or maybe just the patient was from another area and they just need to talk to the patient's primary care providers anyways. Telepath lets us do this. And nice thing is, most places will have a slide base. So if you get a chance when you're at either your job or your clinicals, see if you can find where all the slides are stored. We used to have a nice big basement storage. It was a super creepy basement, kind of place that looks like you're gonna get murdered, but all their slides were kept there, right? So you could go in and the case numbers would be written on the thing, the year from 2000 or 1980 or whatever. All the slides would be there. Now CAP only requires you to keep them for 10 years, so we didn't have slides from 1980. But you'll notice that a lot of hospitals are very cautious and want to keep things a little bit longer than CAP suggests. So even though CAP says 10 years, really we're going to keep those for maybe 15, 20. But the problem is you need a space for that. So With Telepath and these slide scanning softwares, guess what? We don't have to use those scary basements, risking our chance of possibly getting murdered to find a slide. Instead, we can just pull it up in the database. And so here, you guys use something similar in histology lab, right? You got all these slides that are kind of printed out and you can zoom in on the areas. And typically what you're seeing here is you have to bracket out the area you want scanned. So these high-res scans take a long time, and you want to make sure that you're covering the areas of interest. And sometimes you can just do generic scans of the whole slide. But let's say you want to do a high power 40x or 100x on a particular region. You can do that on these individual sections. And you can get really good detail. So again, you see this stuff in histolab. We have all these slide collections and things like that. Now take that on a grander scale when you're dealing with patient slides. Now having access to all those. So instead of not only just being able to pull up the path results, you can pull up, okay, they did have some atypical cells, but what did those look like? Well, I'm just going to pull them up from my slide database and see, oh yeah, they were very similar to what I'm seeing now. So okay, it's consistent, which is good. I haven't had a change in a couple of years, but these slide databases are great for that. And what I used to do is in the hospital setting, if I was doing a frozen section for a transplant, we'd want to make sure that tumor is viable, or sorry, the tissue is viable. And so the pathologist would be home and I'd be on call, and I'd go into the hospital at the wee hours of the morning when they get an organ, and we just do a quick little frozen section. And then I'd go scan these cassettes, and then the pathologist can just verify, yep, it looks clean, or no, this liver looks a little too fatty, we don't want to use it for transplant. So it's also good for some of that, so that only one poor soul like myself has to wake up at 2 a.m. and go into work and scan a slide. Want. All right, so specimen photography you guys are intimately familiar with. This is something we've talked about already. You guys will be taking pictures, especially in your clinical year, but don't stop there. I assure you, picture taking is one of the funnest parts of this job, and a lot of places may not have the best setup. So look at this. This is like the Cadillac of specimen photography. I've never had access to that. Some places just have a DSLR camera, and some still just have a point and shoot and make you take it on a paper towel, and that's sad. But specimen photography will have patient information, because what do you do on that photograph? Got to make sure that case number is right there on the bottom, right? So that you can say, oh yeah, case number 1234, that goes to that patient. So this is the picture for that patient. So also things we don't think about is radiographs. So radiographs have their own systems. So you'll hear about a PACS system that's specifically for radiology. It stands for Picture Archiving and Communication System. So talking about all those systems having to integrate, so if radiology has their own system, we want to make sure we can pull those images from radiology, and maybe we look up, okay, the breast biopsy said there was a couple of calcifications. Let's see if we can pull that up. And that won't be in your LIS, but we want to make sure that the system is easier. Usually the first thing you'll do is go to the EMR and find the pictures there. A lot of times pathologists or pathicists don't have access to the PACS system. But also for the images we do take in the clinical lab, we can create a clinical image repository. And so basically this is our portion. While you're taking the x-rays over in radiology, we're going to take these nice, gorgeous pictures of specimen pathology and store them in our LIS, or we can create like a separate secure folder that you can pull up eventually. Ultimately, the ideal solution is to be able to tie them to the case, right? So that the patient might even be able to see them, or the pathologist can see the picture that you took, or maybe the practicing physician or the surgeon working on the case can pull up that picture as well, because that'll get transferred to the EMR. So these repositories are really nice, because at the end of the day, you take the picture, and if it's a nice system like this, that all gets uploaded automatically. So there's a couple of standalone systems that you can get. I have not used one of these. Like I said, sometimes you just get a DSLR camera and maybe a light box, which is probably the best you can hope for. But you know, we can talk to you guys too about trying to set up your own system. I do think photography is kind of a fun aspect of this job. So spot imaging and Sakura are sort of the two really like specimen photography setups that if you can get the budget for, awesome. They're set up to be implemented into an LIS. They're ready to go. They have these nice high-res cameras that allow you to zoom, and usually can do everything from your keyboard, which is fantastic. So now let's take a look at acquisition of systems. So it won't be uncommon for you as a pathicist to be involved in some of the decision-making in a surgical pathology lab. And so you might play a role in the acquiring of a new LIS. So it's important that you have information for that. so that you can get the best of the best. Otherwise saying all your LARs belong to us. And if you get that reference, we can be friends. So how do you get a new system? We have 3 main steps. First, you want to perform an inclusive needs assessment. Then you want to research the availability of instruments in the marketplace. And then evaluate all the data collected to determine what to acquire. Pretty easy, right? So first, performing an inclusive needs assessment. So you might be like me and just look at cool things in the lab and maybe some of the Fisher magazines and say, I want that. I need that specimen photography set. This LIS is sweet. Let's buy it. Unfortunately, we have to work in the constraints of the budget of the surgical pathology. And there's going to be multiple pulls on that budget. Maybe histology needs some new equipment. Maybe they need to renovate the new lab. Maybe other systems are out of date. So sometimes you get the basics and the bare bones like a working LIS. However, you might not be able to get voice recognition or cassette tracking for a while, although those are usually tied to quality assurance. So a lot of places want to include those when they can. So really it's just kind of the specimen photography that you might not get for a while, which is sad. So you can't just decide that you need everything from the get-go. You really have to decide what you need and why. And you need to do an inclusive needs assessment. So the way that happens is maybe you're the team lead on this, or you get called in by a team lead. So the lab manager is usually going to set this up and say, okay, we need to get a couple of people that are going to be involved in this decision-making process. This will include representation from all aspects of the lab, histology. So in the context of this, side note, we're going to do a, assume this is an LIS that we're trying to get. Maybe we want to upgrade from window path to copath. So let's get everyone who's going to use this system involved. That's going to be the surge path, techs, the PAs. We'll get one PA, one histotech, maybe the histotech manager. We'll get a pathologist, all people who are going to kind of know the ideas of what this system should do. We also want to make sure that we include people from the hospital, usually hospital IT, because again, we want to make sure this system plays nice with the hospital system. You can't just get the creme de la creme and say, too bad, hospital, you got to get on my page. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. So IT has to basically say, okay, yeah, this system will work, or here's what we need to do to make sure that system will work with our EHR. You also want to identify the system goals. So we talked about earlier the benefits of the system as well as what makes an ideal system. So now it's your time to sit down and say, what do we realistically need for this system? How would this system work in our organization? You know, some places have a plethora of cassettes and they need to accommodate that. Other places, they might only get like 9,000 specimens a year and they don't need to go bells and whistles on this thing. But you do want to make sure that you're also taking into account the future expansing of the lab. So sure, maybe you're only getting 9,000, but you're also understanding that a new breast clinic is opening up. So we're probably going to get a lot more breast specimens, a lot more breast biopsies. So that might implement a growth expectation in the future. We want to make sure that our system can account for that. So you have to take all this in. It's very holistic in that approach. And then you have to prioritize and outline system requirements. So who's going to use this system? How are we going to get feedback for this system? You can start getting suggestions from people, you know, start maybe handing out surveys and say, if we were to get a new system, or what is one thing you don't like about this current system? What is one thing you do like? Things like that. And we can start getting some very cursory review of videos. So let's go take a look at a copath introductory video and see if it's something we like, or look at their web page and say, oh yeah, okay, I like some of these features, don't really need that, but maybe we can tweak it to meet our needs. So again, this inclusive needs assessment is very, very inclusive. You got to think about past and present and future. You want to think about all people that could be using it, or all people that might interact with it. So let's say you want to, it's an LIS that we're going to be using, and I already told you radiology doesn't have access to our LIS typically, but they might have a need to work with this system. They might want to have something that PACS can automatically transfer things to an LIS as well as to the EHR. So stuff like that, you just got to have a team thinking about. So it's a really think tank priority in step one. Step two is kind of a fun one. This is sort of the legwork. So you want to research the availability of instruments in the marketplace. So you can use research firms. So these things are neat, this Gartner and Class. So if you want to have some fun, I think one of them is paid and I forget all of a sudden which one it is, but they might have some free options that you can kind of meander with. But at the end of the day, if you're a hospital and you want to get the best information you can, you'll pay for the research firm to kind of do the work for you. And what they'll do is they'll take a complete exhaustive list of all LIS on the market, their strengths and weaknesses, where they're more commonly found, how many hospitals have one versus the other, things like that. And it basically just pulls it all up for you. Or if you want to look at a particular company, again, you can pull this up on these research firms and it'll just have it there. So theoretically, you can use these for anything. So if you're trying to just make a decision on like where to go for dinner, maybe the research firm can help. So conferences and trade shows next. And this is just kind of like playing by ear or getting sort of your foot in the door for a lot of these potential systems that you might implement. So if you're going to a conference, not only is it a time to sort of catch up on your old teachers or friends and colleagues, but you'll also see they have these like trade shows. So they might have some Faxatrons set up, grossing benches that you can look at, and they have all the new and neat stuff, and it'll make you jealous. And if you're like me, you geek out and wish that you could just have one because it has a camera in it and like its own sink and garbage disposal and all the fun stuff that I don't have. But what you can do is start talking to some of the reps and start creating those points of contact, and they can get in touch with you, or they can give you an idea of cost, or at least say, hey, we're in the market for a new grossing bench, or hey, you guys got an LIS, we need an LIS, so maybe we can start talking. And that leads us into networking. So sometimes it's just a matter of talking to other PAs you work with, other healthcare providers, and saying what they use. You want to get an idea for, okay, this is what they're telling me in their sales pitch, but how do you interact with this? I know your hospital's been using this for 2 years. What happens when this happens? What happens when you get this information? How do you accommodate this? So networking is always good. So when you're at those PA conferences, you can talk to people, and maybe you bypass someone and they say, oh man, I've been working with Copath for a couple of years. And you're like, oh, how do you like it? What do you like about it? The other thing is you can actually go to these hospitals and see how it works. So it's not uncommon for some of these sort of assessment groups to actually take trips to local hospitals or facilities maybe farther away and just see this stuff in action. Spend a day in the lives of that hospital's search path team and just say, okay, like, let's just see this work in practice. And that's a nice way to do it too. So those are kind of the demonstrations that you can get. Or sometimes the company can actually give you a demonstration software, although that's harder to do with things like an LIS or I know Faxatron, they'll send you a Path Vision if you want to try it out and see if your hospital will like it. They'll give you one for like a week. So that's always kind of nice. The problem with that is you're just playing with it. It's not really implemented into your system. And then finally, as you start researching, you're starting to put together points for request for proposal or request for information. So a request for proposal or a request for information, and most of the one we'll talk about is proposal. And this is sort of an information packet that takes together all those points we previously discussed, everything you know about what you're looking for in a system, and everything you want to know about the prospective purchased, or the prospective party that you're going to purchase it from. Usually you'll send out a couple of these, but they are an extensive research project. So, and it's kind of sort of the preliminary to maybe creating a contract with that person because you want to get price points. Now, obviously you don't just go with one and hope for the best. You got to make sure you play with their, what are you offering me? What are some of the things you're willing to negotiate on, sort of mentality. But these will provide a comprehensive review from everything you discussed with the assessment team to your future wants and needs to what you could theoretically get out of this system. And maybe the system vendor can talk about things that you probably didn't know you need. I'm sure they're more than happy to tell you that. And basically you send this off to the vendor and they'll wait for a response. So some of the typical things, I have the key sections in the RFP on the right. You can kind of take a look, and that will be part of your lab assignment, is sort of making one of these put together and trying to nuance the information that you have available to you and make educated decisions. And that's ultimately what we have to do. Realistically, there's not a right or wrong answer when you're deciding this stuff, but it's nice to minimize the workflow, and it's nice when you don't make a poor decision. I said it won't necessarily be bad, but it could have been a better one. All right, finally, step 3. So you sent out your RFPs, you've got all your data, you talked to your friends, you went down to the hospital and saw some of this stuff in action about the one you're thinking about, or maybe a couple you're thinking about. And so now it's time to evaluate that data, and we got to decide. So first, we identify any of the vendors that might have matched our goals. So after maybe we got an RFP from 2 of the vendors, or maybe even 3, we said, okay, this one really kind of sits with what we need. The pricing is just right. Some of their features are fine. they don't have this feature that company A has, but it's fine. We don't absolutely need it. And then you're going to come to a consensus for anyone who's using the system frequently. Now, if you want to implement a system well, the goal is you want to make it our system. And what I mean by that is you're going to have to talk to everyone, the histotechs, the grossing techs, the path assists, the pathologist. Instead of just saying, this is what we're getting, so tough it up, you want to make sure that they're on board. They see the value in a new system, because it's really easy that if they don't like the system or it just creates more work for them, or they perceive it creates more work for them, then they're going to sort of resist. And maybe they'll work with the system, but ultimately they'll find shortcuts, and everyone can find shortcuts, believe me. So once you've kind of settled on that software, you'll do a cost-benefit analysis. So you're going to total up all the costs of not just the hardware. So they'll give you the price of the hardware, software, but there's all these other external factors that you might not even have thought about. So you have to think about, what is the maintenance cost of this? What happens if this system breaks down? How easy is it to fix? So one thing to think about, and this will kind of haul up in your lab for this course or for this lecture, is if a lot of network users are using it in your area, it might be easier to kind of contact someone and get tech support, essentially by talking to another hospital. But if you're one of the only users in that area, it might be harder to get support for that system. So it's something to think about, right? And so you have to take all this into account when deciding on whether this system is actually right for your organization. So eventually you're going to take all these costs and weigh them against the benefits. And if you think you can quantify some of the benefits, and some of the harder ones are like, okay, it'll save us time. Usually the go-to is it improves patient quality of care. More quality assurance. If we get this cassette tracker, we can better track where the specimen is, we can better improve our turnaround times, and that ultimately benefits the patient, spin that angle. So you combine all those, and then as an assessment team, you basically make the decision like, yes, we're going to implement this system. So once you've decided on that, you add your assessment team, now you're going to establish an implementation team. And that could be the same as the team you were just working with. It can be a brand new team. So a lot of these organizations, they like creating teams. So what you're going to do with this is now decide, okay, this is the system we're going to get. We're going to go through a purchase order and everything about it. Now we have to get it into our organization. And so you need to establish a project plan. And this is going to be, again, something you can do with the lab for this week. So a Gantt chart is really useful, and we'll see what that looks like in the next page. It kind of looks like this, but this is a breakdown of kind of the steps you need to worry about. So again, we've already decided this is our LIS. We decided for purposes of practice, we're going with Copath. We went from window path, we're going to Copath. We like it, price is right. Come on down. So first we're going to look at our workflow process and analysis. That's way over there. Can't reach. I only have a small arm. So first we're going to evaluate the current system. So we kind of already did this, right? But now it's a matter of really looking at how that system that you are taking and how you're going to implement is going to work on a day-to-day basis. So sitting in the lab, looking at the workflow, looking at any sort of problematic areas in the system, any bottlenecks, what days are usually slower, which days tend to be more busier. Are there any weaknesses you can overcome in the current workflow? Are there any sort of areas that are redundant, and maybe we can use this as an opportunity to excise those from our workflow process. So again, the implementation team or acquisition team is going to look at all that and kind of start planning, because the next step is we want to install the software. So we're going to install our Copath system on all our computers that are pertinent to its usage. So everything in SurgePath, histology, all the pathologist computers are going to get this software installed. Now it's just going to be kind of a dummy software for the time being. It's not activated and no one should be opening it up or playing with it. And so usually IT will have it locked down. But at the end of the day, this is a good time to start building up those libraries I mentioned originally, thinking about, all right, we looked at our work process. This is the libraries we know we need. These are the way we do our protocols. These are the templates we want to add to the system, and get that all ready to go. And next, we're going to do some training. So we want to make sure that our staff are ready to go when we make this system live. So we do SOPs for this. We'll talk about SOPs, which are standard operating procedures. You want to make sure employees are reading those, documenting those, and that those are completely recorded. And you also want to make sure there's contact personnel for when the system breaks or who's going to kind of be in charge of this. And usually when we talk about preventative maintenance, you want to kind of diversify that a little bit so now that it's not all stuck on one person. You're going to test the system. So now that it's installed, we can start kind of doing some mock demonstrations on your current workflow and see how it handles that. You can run some basic tests, you can build up some mock patients and things like that, and just kind of run through the process and see if there's any hiccups you can kind of get out. And then finally the time will come when you need to go live. And this can be scary, so ultimately you want to pick a day that's very non-busy. A lot of times these hospitals will do these on like a Sunday night or a Saturday over the weekend, because if there's a skeleton crew on the weekend, they kind of start working out the kinks. Ideally, you don't want to put too much stress on the system, but you want to have enough stress that you can actually see where things might fail, right? Because if you just go in and you get 2 cases in a day and the system's, oh, it's working great, it's fine. And then the next day we get 200 cases and it crashes out, well, now we're in a downtime issue because we switched over. And you have to decide whether we go back to the new system or if the new system's even operable because everything's in place for this, or for the old system, but if everything's in place for the new system, that's not always an option. So go lives can be scary, but if you've done everything right as the implementation team, it should be good to go. And so here's that Gantt chart. You guys can make one of these for your lab. It just kind of breaks down, like theoretically, you would actually put dates in there, not just week 1 through whatever. But it gives you an idea of like, okay, we should have this part of the project done by this date. That gives us 3 weeks for this part. Then we have 3 weeks for this other part. And you can see there's overlapping. So it just kind of gives people an idea of where the process should be theoretically at, and ultimately where you can have your go live date that everyone can plan on at the end of the day. So I already mentioned this, user resistance is a real thing. Quality will always add time. All right, anytime you add cassette tracking, it's an extra step that the PA has to do. If you go from, I've seen hospitals where they write case numbers on the cassettes. I mean, granted, I think that takes more time, but if you have to get it set up where now patients have to go in, you have to print out how many cassettes you need rather than just grabbing whatever you need and writing on it, it's another step. And sometimes people they'll make shortcuts, they'll try to make their lives easier. So you have to be aware of this, it will happen, but at the end of the day, make it everyone's system. Like I said, make the system ours. So you got to show value in it. You got to make sure that it's all about the patient, not about the user. And you want to make sure that people can see that there is value to utilizing it, and it's not about trying to make their work or their life harder. It's about ultimately protecting the patient's information. So we did this process for information systems. This process can also be applied to equipment. So if you're getting a new scanning machine like a Faxitron or a PathVision in the lab, or you're getting a Specimen Photography system, notice how I keep going back to that because I just love them. And that's, you apply the same practice we just did on all this implementation. And ultimately, you will have to have standardized use, so all that training is important because CAP will ask about it. Especially if you have a CAP visit and you show them, hey, here's our new PathVision for scanning biopsies and bone specimens. They're like, great, where's your SOP on that? And you don't want to be caught with your, I guess, hands in the air. I don't know what the equivocal value of that would be. But you don't want to basically look like a fool and say, well, you just know how to use it. It's like a microwave. So you got to make sure that all this new equipment, all these new systems are standardized and everyone's doing the exact same thing. And again, preventing that user resistance, preventing those weaknesses, preventing those areas where there could be hiccups. All right, so let's take a look at standard operating procedures and how you actually standardize the use of this information. So an SOP, or standard operating procedures, is just a set of written instructions that are documented so that every time an organization uses a task or has an activity, it's going to be done consistently in the same way. So there are literally SOPs for everything. And theoretically, there should be an SOP for grossing specific specimens, and that's kind of what a grossing guideline will be. But some hospitals actually do have SOPs for it. And I'll just tell you how many cassettes you should be submitting and what stains to be using. And the goal is to ultimately ensure consistency. So when you have an SOP, it means you're going to have quality work constantly performed, because an SOP should have been well thought out, it should have been researched and kind of fleshed out, and they can be modified. So if you realize, oh, we've been doing this, but research says we should be doing that, update the SOP, and now everyone's doing that. right? So all personnel should theoretically be on the same page. So if you get someone new in, you just say, hey, here's an SOP, you should be good to go by tomorrow, which will expedite the training of that new personnel. Point number 2. So ultimately, hiring new staff could be problematic, but if you have all your systems in place, it makes it really easy for them to find the information they need. They can get up and running in a lot quicker time. And then if CAP comes in and you want to show that you're playing nice by the rules, SOPs are a great way to do that. You might have them all on a computer, and the goal is make sure they're easily accessible, because you don't want one of your employees to be asked, oh, where's the SOP for this piece of equipment? They say, I don't know, probably in that book over there. That's not going to look good for management. Instead, it should be, oh, it's in this book, or I can go on the computer and click this file and bam, they're opened up. Okay, so SOPs are really great for that. You might be involved in writing an SOP, and in order to do that, we're going to use the Clinical Laboratory Standards and Institute. So this is a guideline for writing SOPs. And while CAP didn't design this guideline, they actually encourage the use of this guideline for writing an SOP. And the basic premise of that we'll look at shortly, but you want to make sure that procedures are written for everything. So we think about just the analytical component of surgical pathology, which means when we're actually doing the testing and all the aspects of that testing. But we got to remember that stuff happens before us and stuff happens after us. So all that stuff needs to make sure it has a procedure written for it. So in the pre-analytical phase, which is before we get it, you got to make sure that the order entries are consistent, specimen collection, everyone's using Telepath and that accessioning process identically. Everyone's putting in the same work codes, everyone's using the same CPT coding and things like that. The analytical the analytical part is a step-by-step process for the actual grossing or testing. And so that could be as simple as having a protocol for dissection of a thyroid. It's all written down in an SOP, and you could show that to CAP when they come. And then you'll have a post-analytical phase, which is where the pathologist comes in, and they should have a SOP or procedures in place on how to report and sign out, make sure storing of specimens is consistent, and that anyone who comes in brand new can do it, follow it, and theoretically can read through piles and piles of documents and know exactly where everything is. So what you want to include on an SOP typically is going to have a purpose. So you want to state, like, this is an SOP for the grossing of a thyroid. What is the scope? This is for anyone who grosses a thyroid. So that's going to be pathocysts, grossing techs, maybe even a pathologist, residents. Definitions. Here you'll define any sort of terms that are pertinent to this thing. So if someone encounters those in the procedure, they can say, oh, what's a thyroid? Thyroid is a glandular organ in the throat. Hopefully that's not the explanation you need, but all that will be included. And then the actual procedure. So it is going to be step by step, and you don't want to leave anything out. So at the end of the day, you got to make sure you account for all sorts of redundancy. So specimen is going to be received on the bench. Make sure you pull it out of the container. Make sure you wash it off if need to. Everything will be included. Close up your cassettes, stick it in there. So you don't want to make any assumptions on the end user's part. And then ultimately you want to finish it by having references. So where did this information come from? Did you just make it up out of whole cloth? Or did you get it from the grossing guidelines? So you want to make sure that your information is sound and doesn't seem like it just came out of like, oh, this is what we decided to do, and 3 of us got together and said, screw it, we're done, this is fine. And then I said these things can be updated as long as you're keeping track of the revisions. So usually it'll say version 3, the updates were made on these 2 dates, and this is what has been changed. Some places won't have track changing, but I think it's really nice because especially if you want to train and you want to make sure people are compliant, again, you got to make sure things are user friendly. So what we'll do is say, okay, here's what we changed. Instead of 6 cassettes for a thyroid, we want to make 7. And then they can look at the change history and say, okay, that's what we changed. Good, I can do that, rather than trying to weed through an entire SOP and figure out what's different. Okay, and finally, let's take a look at system maintenance. So we've got a new system in place, whether it's an LIS or maybe some voice recognition software or cassette tracking software. We want to make sure that thing is maintained, right? It can't just be plug and play and it's done for the rest of its existence. Systems will break down, systems will need care, and systems will need love. And we have to do that. So let's talk a little bit about everyday use and quality control. So when we want to think about quality control of these systems and making sure they're being used effectively, it's not just, all right, we had our go live date, I'm going to just assume everything's working from here on out. We want to make sure that it's doing what we paid for it to do, right? You know, if the LIS isn't maximizing its ability, if we can't get this feature to work, that we got the system because it had that feature, that's kind of a big deal. So ultimately our systems are there to improve quality of care. We want to make sure that they're doing that, not just having, you know, a nice little fancy new coat of paint. So we got to make sure that the training is reviewed. So if we have staff that are using this system, a lot of times the organization will include like, okay, here's your renewal for training, go back and just sign off on the SOPs, or, you know, make sure that a new change was added. So an email sent out and told anyone who signed off on this SOP originally now has to go double check. Competency checks are the thing that CAP is starting to implement. So if it's a new, let's go back to a Path Vision from Faxitron. It's this X-ray scanning machine. We want to make sure that people are using it properly and that you're actually using it to its abilities and not just kind of minimize use. So, oh, I just put the specimen in and press this button is fine, but you have to make sure that, okay, what happens if there's an issue? Can I do some basic troubleshooting on this software or hardware to make sure it's getting the maximum use out of it? Are the files being backed up? Are there hard copies? We want to make sure that that's kind of keeping track and where are those files being backed up. So if this is the LIS system that we implemented earlier, we have to make sure that someone's in charge of backing up those files. You know, that's part of our maintenance too, is okay, every week maybe we take all those files that we came in and we got to shove them to the backup. A lot of times that's not, well, it can be automated, but we got to just make sure it's getting done. And these systems are going to need routine maintenance. So typically a yearly maintenance, sometimes it's a couple years, but you have to make sure that, okay, the bulbs aren't burning out, or it's still working as effective as we need it to be, or everything is a-okay. You know, there's no hiccups in our workflow. Also part of everyday use, we have to think about the security of the systems that we are using. Remember, this is all for healthcare informatics. It's got healthcare information and it needs to be protected per HIPAA. So all those LIS, all that Faxitron stuff, anything that you are using with the patient has to make sure that it can be locked down and secured. So it has to have password access, has to make sure that the records are restricted and can only be used for what they need to be used for. And if it's a software, you have to make sure you're up to date on all your malware and antiviral, and just practicing good computer practices. So don't walk away from your station with your computer with access to your CoPath wide open so that someone can theoretically come in and start looking at things, because that would be on you for improperly using the computer and the software. So those things have to be taken into account every day. Also physical security. So where we're doing these backups, so maybe we have our servers, we have to make sure that the location is secure and they're protected from any sort of environmental hazards. So if they're kind of under some vents that are known to get condensation, and that might run risks for them getting moisture in the servers, that's something we have to be mindful of. Additionally, only usually people from IT should have access to those servers. So you got to make sure that those physical access points are restricted as well. The other thing to think about with security is on the opposite end. You can't be too secure to the point where if the system gets locked down, you can't access it. So if, for instance, our LIS does go down, can we get the patient information? Is there easy access to that backup? That's not going to affect our workflow directly. Or to the point where we can just say, oh, we can't roast today because, you know, we have no access to the LIS. I can't print cassettes, and that's never usually the case. And we'll talk about downtime later. But that's also something that you have to consider when dealing with maintenance of a system, is all these security flows. Another thing to think about with everyday use and maintenance is data retention. So not only does the software and hardware have to be secure and locked down and safe and prevented access from those who shouldn't have it, but on the post-analytical side, we want to make sure that if we need to get access to those reports, we have access to them. We make sure that we're complying with the CAP recommendations for holding reports. So pathology reports should be held onto for 10 years. And like I said, hospitals tend to do that a little bit longer, just for security's sake. And I would mean like personal security. But what happens after you've had a report for 15 years? Do you want to keep all reports for the last 30 years, 40 years, 50? Maybe hospitals do, but all that means is we have to keep storage up. And so someone has to be responsible for making sure those are properly stored to a point where they can be accessed. Quality assurance reports, we have to make sure that those are documented. So we talked about holding quality assurance and keeping people responsible. So when you're doing that by running reports on an LIS to see how your case volumes fare, those things should be easily accessible to CAP when they come visit if it happened within the last 2 years. The other thing is using external transfers. So if you want to come in, you can get an external hard drive for a lot of data and take digital data and secure it physically, essentially. That can be done regularly. So that could be someone coming in every Saturday and just uploading files to a secure location. Or maybe once every year, you basically just take a hard dump of all the files in that report and say, this is 2020 files, bam, full in the folder, and call it a day. So this is all something that you should be taking into account when you do your implementation team and acquisition team, because you want to make sure, like, okay, how are we saving this data? How are we going to retrieve this data? And something to think about is what's going to happen in the future. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with the A disk drives. There's like those hard disks, and if you look at every file saved icon, that's an A disk drive. However, if you had data on one of those disk drives, and granted they hold like 3 megabytes, how are you going to access that now? You know, there's no real easy way to get access to the information on those things, and that's stuff you have to take into account when saving data. Sure, we use USB now. Are we going to be using USB entry points for the next 10 years? Maybe, but who knows, right? So all that stuff you have to take into account. So what that ultimately means is making sure that you have effective preventive maintenance, and stuff like the data security and data retrieval can be part of a preventative maintenance plan. So when you're putting together your purchase plan and deciding on how you're going to implement a new software or a new hardware, you also want to have negotiations and discuss how your preventative maintenance is going to look. Some places will include like a preventative maintenance plan as part of their purchase agreement. So you can say, okay, well, if you buy this, we'll give you free preventative maintenance for 5 years. Basically, we'll have some guy come in every so often, or some guy or girl will come in and basically tighten your screws and make sure your lenses are working, or clean up your software, make sure everything looks great. That's all included. And then after 5 years, you have to kind of figure that out on your own. But what preventive maintenance is actually its own separate entity, right? It has to be done and it has to be scheduled because we want to make sure that this thing keeps working. Anything we do to replace parts or clean parts is preventative maintenance. So even something like, okay, dusting your keyboard is in some way, shape, or form of preventative maintenance. So you can either treat this as a program, which is every 6 months we go and replace the parts, or we change out the light bulb on our Faxitron, or we do a system reboot, whatever you want to do. Maybe you have a scheduled program in place, or you can treat it as a process. So every year we update our SOP and make sure that we're doing things effectively, and we kind of self-regulate or self-audit our own process. Ultimately, the goal is we want to prevent malfunctions. You don't want to be working on a piece of equipment and then all of a sudden it just stops working. Imagine working on a cryostat and then you can't get a frozen section to cut. It stops maintaining heat, and all of a sudden, you're left with your only cryostat, unable to process the 10 frozens that you have behind you because it just stopped working. And maybe that's partly because someone didn't do the regular checks or didn't notice that your mount head was a little loose 2 weeks ago, and they just didn't do anything about it. Ultimately, malfunctions could jeopardize the quality of care. If they're silent and maybe go unnoticed, you might be including those in your reports without even noticing it. But they can also jeopardize the life cycle of your equipment. If it's malfunctioning often, it means you either might not keep the equipment, you might not be using it to the full potential, or it might just run down faster. It's like if you don't change your oil in your car regularly, which would be preventative maintenance, you might seize up your engine, which is going to be what we'll talk about shortly, corrective maintenance. So what's interesting to think about too is with our current technology increases, and as things get easier and easier to sort of become self-reliant, preventive maintenance has become a little bit easier. All right, so now we have our cars that are telling us when check engine light comes on, and you can say, oh, something's wrong with my car, and then you can just decide to ignore it on your own. Well, LIS or equipment in the surgical pathology lab can also have tools that'll basically say, hey, you might want to clean this filter out. It seems like it's been here for a couple of days, weeks or months. Or maybe, hey, there's an error detection in this file process. And so now it becomes an automated process where you don't have to think about what preventative maintenance you need to perform. You just do it because the computer or whatever else tells you like this should be fixed. The contrary to that is that maintenance costs have increased. And we'll talk about corrective maintenance in just a second. So the biggest takeaway is that preventative maintenance is scheduled maintenance. So those will include things like hardware repair and replacements, software updates, so getting that regular Windows update and clicking, yes, finally I'll install that update, is considered preventative maintenance. Security updates, so making sure your stuff isn't getting accessed, or maybe your malware decided, oh, hey, look, there's this new virus on the streets that all these kids are uploading. Maybe you should protect yourself against it. That update is preventative maintenance. Data backup and data retrieval are all part of that process. So that stuff can be scheduled. Okay, so now how do we implement a PM? Ultimately, the goal is we should be avoiding downtime. So you don't want to implement preventative maintenance at a time where theoretically it's a higher volume of cases or when you need the equipment the most. Preventative maintenance is scheduled, so let's schedule it at a time that's more convenient. You don't want to be doing it on a Thursday afternoon, updating your parts on a cryostat when that happens to be the time where most of your frozens come in to the lab. So do yourself a favor, schedule that at weekends, evenings. If you have a third shift, they can probably do some of that stuff too. But usually in the off hours or off peak hours. And again, it's scheduled, so you have that option. It's when it's not scheduled that becomes problematic. But theoretically, preventative maintenance can help avoid that. And also, like I said, you want to factor this into a purchase agreement. It might add to the initial cost, but again, if you're getting regular updates or regular check-ins from the company or the vendor, if they come every year, every 6 months to check on the software or hardware, that ultimately will save you money, and so it's worth including. So this is a perfect time when you're negotiating the purchase price, try to negotiate what a PM cost might look like and what you would actually need for that. So those are things to include in your request for proposal. You want to determine responsibility. This was part of the implementation process as well, if you recall. Who's going to be responsible for scheduling this and making sure it's done? If you just kind of say, all right, guys, make sure this gets preventively maintained, and then it just falls on nobody, chances are nobody's going to do it. Also, you also want to make sure multiple people are involved in that process, just in case, Larry over in histology, who normally does all the PM, decides to quit or retire. And now, oh, well, the cryostat, Larry used to fix that for us. He's gone. Now what do we do? Oops. So you don't want to find that to be your position, although if you are the person that everyone relies on, it's really good job security, so you can always kind of go that route too. But again, making sure you have a point person so that if it doesn't get done, you can say, hey, Larry, why wasn't that done on Thursday when we usually do our preventative maintenance? So take that into account. Also, you have to document things. The one important thing for quality is if it's not documented, it didn't happen, and that's something that I've heard throughout my entire life in labs, and you guys will probably hear the same. So you want to make sure that it's documented. I did preventative maintenance on Saturday, October 7th at 8 p.m. And you want to make sure that that's next to the equipment that you're maintaining, because that way it's easy to access and you can visually see, okay, yep, this was checked. Or if something goes wrong and you see that it wasn't checked for 3 months, that's a problem too. But it becomes a really easy visual aid to say, oh look, we've missed a period of maintenance here, so maybe we should get on that. However, even with the best plans, even with the best preventative maintenance program that you get from the vendor, ultimately instruments will fail and we need to resort to corrective maintenance. You could be doing everything you can. Let's take cars for instance, you get your oil changed every X number of miles you're supposed to go and you get it, but one day you just get a flat tire. Nothing you could have done could have prevented that. And it's the same with stuff we get in the lab too. So we have to keep that in mind, that we need to be mindful that corrective maintenance is something that will likely happen. Now, when we think about corrective maintenance, ultimately the goal is what's wrong. Because preventative maintenance is nice. You're just going in and doing a set defined task that theoretically are going to wear and tear or need to be done periodically. But corrective maintenance, now we have to do troubleshooting. we have to see where has the error occurred and what can we do to fix it. Now, most of the time you'll get manuals, and you probably had this with just about anything from TVs to, I even have a barbecue thermometer that has a troubleshooting guide. So everything has troubleshooting guides usually as part of their manual. And so you can kind of go through and run what the tasks, what is it doing wrong, and what are the possible fixes. So when you're doing corrective maintenance, if you were able to purchase a warranty or a repair agreement, sometimes you can call in the vendor or the vendor's representative and have them actually come in and fix it. And it's under warranty, they'll do it free, and it's all part of the initial purchase cost. However, if it's not covered, then that might be an additional cost that you have to incur. So again, that's something to be mindful of. Taking it all the way back to our purchase agreement, our RFP, is thinking, okay, worst case scenario, if this thing breaks, even though our warranty is for 2 years, what if it breaks in year 3? What is our realistic repair cost going to look like? So keep that in your mind when you're putting these together. So, and when we do this, we have to make sure that we're documenting all repair. And if we see problems occurring, maybe the same process is problematic every single day or every single week, and we start seeing the same corrective maintenance needing to be done, the same troubleshooting issues coming up, that might speak to a bigger problem with the system itself or the software that we can then either talk to the company, or maybe that's when you indicate this is time for a new software, a new bit of hardware. So troubleshooting, the basic definition is you would analyze and solve serious problems for a company or other organization. And usually you've probably all seen these charts where here's the problem, possible causes, possible remedies. Most of the time those are basically all you need. You can go and do the suggested fix and everything's working a-okay. It's when you don't find the fix on there that things can be problematic, or you might have to get a specialist in. But these are all things that you guys should be capable of, you know, when you're working on a crossset or any piece of grossing equipment that you might use on a regular basis. Familiar yourselves with the ins and outs of that equipment so that you can go in and troubleshoot as needed. And you can say, oh, last time this happened, this worked for fixing it. You know, it tended to be this issue if someone else is complaining about this. But the goal is to trace and correct the faults of either a mechanical or electrical system. And so we want to find those faults, and then we have to repair them. So it's a two-step process. Although, I say it's a two-part process that I divided into 4 steps. So identify the problem, eliminate variables. So what does that mean? So let's take a look at our sheet here. So if we look at the top, we have sections tearing as our problem. So that is step 1. We identified the problem, our sections are tearing, and this is for a cryostat, I believe. Okay, now let's take a look at possible causes. That's going to help us eliminate variables. So let's say, okay, well, if we're worried about the temperature too low, for instance, let's take a look at the temperature, get a thermometer in there. No, the temperature's where it should be, so that's not an issue. Let's get rid of that variable. Maybe there's something new, no bit of workflow. Maybe we never had this specimen before. No, we had. Okay, that's variable is gone. What about a rear face of the knife is dirty? Maybe. Let's test it out. And then when you're doing that, a lot of times, and if you've done this on maybe computers or even with any other equipment, you want to try to replicate the problem, right? If you think it's problem C, well, let's see if it is C, okay? Let's eliminate those variables. We focus in on C. If that's the problem, it should still show up and fix, okay? If we think it's C, we fix C and the problem is still there, we haven't really been able to find our root cause or eliminate all the variables. So if we can reproduce it, we can identify and single out that that's the problem, and we can attempt to fix it. Maybe we can fix it on our own. Maybe we have to get the specialists in to do it for us. But at least we provided some sort of guide and help them along and say, okay, I know it's probably one of these 2 things, but I tried both of these solutions and it didn't work. So now we have to go on to something else. But that's the basis of troubleshooting, and you should be comfortable with that. And just about any work situation, whether you're working on just a basic computer or some high-end surgical pathology equipment. Okay, so let's just give us the quick and dirty for what we just talked about. So at the end of the day, whether it's preventative maintenance or corrective maintenance, you got to document it. If you didn't document it, it didn't happen. If we don't document preventative maintenance, then we don't know if it actually occurred, and if that's part of the problem why we have corrective maintenance. If we don't document the corrective maintenance, we don't have a record to either send to the vendor and say, this is the common problem we have, or we don't have a record to say, this thing keeps happening and it's time for new equipment, and we can present that to maybe our purchasing department and say, look, we have this problem, we've tried fixing it, just didn't happen, and it's happening every month for the last 7 months. And that helps build your case for getting a new piece of hardware or a new piece of equipment or software. So preventative maintenance, the major goal is to prevent malfunctions before quality is compromised. And this can be factored into purchase agreements because you kind of know in advance what you should be expected to do on a regular basis. And you can get the time and money for that from either your organization, or you can maybe negotiate pricing points with the vendor. And this requires a plan of implementation, just like we talked about earlier. You need to know who's doing it, and you need to have it regularly scheduled. So it's all about planning. Corrective maintenance is not planning. Unscheduled repairs, even with a PM in place. So even the best PM can still lead to corrective maintenance. So, and some things to be mindful of is some things could be preventative maintenance in one scenario and corrective maintenance in another. So let's say normally I have to replace a light bulb on a microscope every 6 months, or that's the general preventative maintenance for that. Regardless of whether it's working or not, I just replace it, and that's the end of the day, preventative maintenance. Now, let's say the pathologist is using a microscope, and while he's using it, the light bulb burns out. That's considered corrective maintenance because it has to be done on the spot, it wasn't scheduled, and it's correcting a current problem. Now, it could have been prevented with a PM theoretically, but maybe not. Maybe the bulb just was bad. These are not often factored into your purchasing agreements, but you may get a warranty to cover them, so there's stuff that you can think of that could theoretically go wrong that the company can also help you with. And the biggest thing with corrective maintenance is you got to be good at troubleshooting. So you got to identify where the problem is and how to repair it, and at least have a working knowledge so that if someone else has to come in and repair it, you can say, this is what I tried. And that's always helpful for that. The other thing to keep in mind is that preventative maintenance has gotten significantly easier. So it becomes easier to schedule, easier to do. You know, usually our systems or software equipment will tell us what needs to be fixed and when. You know, we'll get printing errors, we'll get, hey, my filters are running low, or or dirty, my reagents are running low or starting to evaporate. So we know that's going to happen, so we can fix it before it happens or becomes a problem. It's the corrective maintenance that now has become more expensive. And this is something that you just have to be mindful of, and that's why preventative maintenance is even more critical, because sometimes these systems we just can't get in and fix ourselves. If a Faxitron or a PathVision breaks down, neither one of us is probably equipped to get in there, take it apart, and fix it. And the example I like to use is, if anyone's familiar with this system, good old NES, whenever your games didn't work back in the day, what do? You just blew on it, right? That was your form of corrective maintenance, and theoretically it would work. Now, like a new systems, like a PS4, if this thing stops working, what do? You're going to blow on the disk, or you're going to try to take it apart and make sure it starts working again. So that's kind of the visual difference between a corrective maintenance problem and why corrective maintenance now can be more problematic than it was previously. Okay, so we're going to accept the fact that corrective maintenance will happen regardless of whether we want it to or not. The question is, when will it happen? In a nice ideal world, it happens, it becomes a minor inconvenience, and you just move on with your day, get it fixed, and move on. However, in extreme cases, maybe it happens to a system you need right there and then, and it's not an easy fix. You troubleshoot it and you can't find the problem, or the problem is too complex. And this is something that you're relying on. Maybe your LIS is down, maybe your cassette printing is down, maybe your tracking is down. So when we talk about downtime, it's when a system you need is no longer functioning, so you have to come up with a workaround for how that works. So you're planning for failure. Now Rick seems to not want to do that. If anyone's familiar with Rick and Morty, he thinks that's pretty dumb. However, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail, according to Benjamin Franklin. I'll take his advice on this one. Okay. So there's a 2017 survey that found 96% of healthcare institutions report at least one unplanned downtime event in the last 3 years. And of those, 70% were more than 8 hours. That's an entire workday. Or a major downtime event, maybe it was an LIS fail, or any of the other failures I mentioned, basically just didn't work. Maybe their EHR didn't work. So 8 hours is a long time. So plans are often broken down into short term for if you suspect that the system's down for a few hours. So maybe IT realize they need to do an update on their LIS, and they'll say, hey, we just got to get the software downloaded. We'll be good to go in about an hour or two. So you have your short-term downtime. And then there's long-term. So if the problem is, oh great, our computer has a virus, we can't fix this anytime soon, or maybe our Faxitron is completely broken, we have no idea how to fix it, we can't scan the images, and our documents say we have to scan our biopsies or our specimens accordingly. Now we have to do a long-term plan when that system is not in place. So that could be days, it could be weeks. Sometimes it gets to the point of like, oh, our cassette tracking or our cassette printer's not working. That means if it's short term, maybe we can hold off on workflow for a little bit. If it's long term, well, now we have to start maybe manually writing cassette names, or we have to manually write our pathology reports because we can't print them off from Copath or whatever our LIS is. So policies will often use paper documents, especially if it's a virtual system or a digital system. And so that's why some places are a little bit hesitant to go full digital. But they'll usually have some stuff that at the end of the day, someone might have to, when the system comes back up, implement those into your LIS or whatever system is malfunctioned. So ideally what you're ultimately trying to do is avoid any shutdown of operations. So even though your instrument isn't working, you should still be able to do the work you need to do and not put the patient behind on their care because you can't process specimens. So it might be inconvenient, but you might have to go back to some of the very basics of your lab environment. Hopefully if it's a short fix, you can kind of say, okay, well now's a good time, we take lunch and call it a day. But if it's a long fix, chances are you're going to be appreciating some of the finer implementations that you have in your lab after the fact. So it looks like due to our 404 error, that means our lecture is now probably over. So thank you for joining me, and if you have any questions, let me know, and we'll go from there. But hopefully you enjoyed your continuation of laboratory operations.